Well, good morning, church. My name's Adam Brucker. I'm one of the pastors here on staff, and I just want to welcome you in today. Can we give our kids and our kids volunteers a big hand? Man, it's awesome. Awesome to watch them come up here and just praise the Lord. And it was awesome. And so, next weekend is Easter, and we are super excited about it. And so, as Easter approaches, one thing that I'm going to ask you as a church, we're going to be having guests and visitors, and we're having 2 services, and we're going to ask you to move forward, because for some reason, thank you to the high school boys who come sit in the front, but for some reason, there's always a huge gap right here. And so you guys are afraid of me. I might call you out. I won't do it next week, I promise, okay? So we're going to ask you to come forward, park farther away, and allow room for our guests to come in for Easter. And then additionally, I was thinking that when Illinois wins next Saturday, I was thinking that it is still appropriate to wear Illinois gear, even on Easter. I checked with all the wives. They said it was fine, okay? So make sure you wear your Illinois stuff next weekend. I want to invite you this morning to open up to John chapter 12. John chapter 12 is where we're going to be. And today, Palm Sunday, is the beginning of Holy Week. It's the beginning of Holy Week. And I want to just give us a background, because sometimes it feels like things can be disjointed and knowing the history of all the things that happened. So I want to give us a background of the timeline of all the events that happen during Holy Week. And so I put it on a slide for us. And so today, Sunday, is the triumphal entry. We call it Palm Sunday, right? The triumphal entry. And then Monday is when Jesus cleanses the temple. He cleanses the temple. He kicks out those who are using the temple as a place of business and things like that. And then on Tuesday, he has controversy with some of the Jewish leaders and kind of gets them riled up. And then Wednesday, apparently, is a day of rest. It's a day of rest. And it's encouraging for us to know that even in the midst of chaos, that sometimes a day of napping is needed, right? We've been there. And then Thursday, they're preparing for the Passover meal. And then Friday begins the trial and Jesus' crucifixion. And then Saturday, Jesus rests in the tomb. And then Sunday, Jesus is raised from the dead. And so with today being Palm Sunday, I want to just focus on that narrative and unpack what Palm Sunday means and how it applies to us and why it applies to us. And the thing is, this is a very important piece of history, a very important event in the life of Jesus. And we know that because all four Gospels record this event, some version of this event of Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey. And it's really kind of a turning point in Jesus' ministry, and we'll uncover why as we dive in. And the background to this part of the story is that Jesus had become very popular as a teacher and a rabbi. He's becoming more respected, and because of that fact, because he had become popular, many of the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day, and the fact that he had called them out for some of their hypocrisy, and he had said some things that made them frustrated. Because he had done that, he had kind of made enemies with them. They were not a fan of Jesus at this point. And not long before Palm Sunday takes place, Jesus, he had a friend named Lazarus. Lazarus got sick, and before Jesus arrived on the scene at Lazarus' house, his people had told him that he was sick, and they wanted him to come heal, and he gets to Lazarus' house, and Lazarus had already passed away. They'd already put him in a tomb. And then he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised Lazarus from the dead. You can read about this in John chapter 11. And as Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, immediately following that miracle, in verse 47 of John 11, I know I told you John 12, Just giving you some history. John 11, verse 47, it says, "Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. And they said, 'What are we accomplishing?' they ask. 'Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nations.'" You know what they're noticing? They're noticing all the power that they loved and that they were holding dear to them was vanishing between their fingers. And they're like, man, if this guy keeps doing what he's doing, then everyone's going to believe in him, and then we'll have nothing. So these religious leaders, they were extremely threatened by him and his power and his authority and what he was able to accomplish and how their power and authority had just been diminishing. And so in John 11:53, it tells us that so from that day on, they plotted to take his life. From that day on, they plotted to take his life. The tension between Jesus and the religious leaders reaches this boiling point. And in John chapter 12, when so many Jews wanted to see this man who they had watched him raise this guy from the dead, they decided because of what he'd been doing that he needed to die. And it even says that they decided they should also kill Lazarus. They should kill Lazarus too, because Lazarus is now involved. He's now associated with him. And so they should just get rid of both of the problems. And what comes next is that we see Jesus participate in the only public demonstration on his behalf that he allowed to happen: the triumphal entry. So we pick up our story in verse 12 of John chapter 12. It says, "The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and they went out to meet him, shouting, 'Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel.'" And so in this text, we see the crowd going absolutely crazy for Jesus. He's entering Jerusalem, and they see him going crazy. They're waving these palm branches, and they're shouting, "Hosanna, Hosanna," which literally means "save us now." That's what they're saying. That's what they want from Jesus. Save us now. This is a big deal. Palm branches, they were a symbol of Jewish nationalism and victory. So by waving them, they were trying to say, "We've won because our king is here. Save us now." When the crowd waves these branches and shouts these words, they're essentially making this political statement about Jesus. They want a king. They want a deliverer. They want someone to come in and overthrow Rome and the oppression that Rome has been on the Jewish people, and to restore Israel to its former glory. So the story continues in verse 14. It says, "Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. As it is written," this is what Kenton read earlier, "Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt." So John is quoting Zechariah, and then it says, "At first his disciples did not understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him and that these things had been done to him." And now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, they went out to meet him. And so the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." This crowd who was gathering around Jesus, it wasn't a single group of people who were all on the same page. It was different groups from all over. And John identifies these different groups for us. So in verse 12, John tells us about the Passover visitors. People from all over the nation of Israel, they are gathering in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. These were people who had traveled from all over. They had come to observe the Passover, which was the celebration of God delivering Israel out of Egypt. They were celebrating God delivering Israel out of Egypt. It was one of the most sacred moments on the Jewish calendar. But somewhere along the way, the news about Jesus had reached them, and it was enough to pull them out of the city and into the road. They want to see what this man is doing, what he's all about. They had not seen a miracle. They didn't see Jesus raise Lazarus. They had not witnessed anything firsthand. They were going off of reports and word of mouth, and yet that was enough. The story of what Jesus had done had traveled far enough and carried enough weight that even people who had no direct experience with him were moved to respond. Then in verse 17, we see a different group. These were locals. These were people who had been around. They'd actually maybe been present at the tomb when Lazarus was raised, when Jesus had called him out. They had watched Jesus pray. They had heard him shout, "Lazarus, come out." And they had seen a dead man walk out of a tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths. These people were not going off of rumors. They had seen it with their own eyes. And they could not stop talking about it. John actually tells us in verse 17 that they kept testifying about what they had witnessed. They kept talking about it. It was such a big deal. They couldn't keep quiet. This was not a crowd that was manufactured or worked up. They had seen the way Jesus worked, and they responded. This was a group of people who had seen something so undeniable. They had no other option but to talk about it. And then verse 19 gives us a third group who is standing off to the side, and they are watching all of this unfold. It's the Pharisees. They are not loving this. They are religious leaders, and they notice what they say to one another. Look how the whole world has gone after him. Obviously, they're sensationalizing here. They're saying, man, everybody, the whole world has gone after Jesus. Well, that's not the case. The whole world hasn't gone after Jesus. This is actually a very small contingent of people that Jesus had been interacting with. But they were not celebrating. They were not curious. They were seething. They were angry. To them, this was a crisis. Everything that they had built, all the power that they had accumulated, and all the respect they had built, all their reputation, their authority, their position in the community, it felt like it was slipping away because of this one man from Nazareth. Three groups. Three completely different relationships to Jesus, three completely different understandings of who Jesus was. And yet all of them are present here on this road to Jerusalem. In the same moment, on the same road, watching the same man ride into the city on a donkey. And so what happens when all of this energy pours into Jerusalem? Matthew's account of this story, it tells us that all the city was stirred. All the city was stirred. Not just the people who came out to meet Jesus, not the pilgrims or the witnesses or the Pharisees. The entire city of Jerusalem is thrown into kind of a holy disruption. And the question that erupts out of the streets is, who is this? Who is this guy that is coming into town? Who is this? What does he mean for us? Jerusalem itself becomes a character in the story. A city who is wrestling with an invitation it cannot ignore. So the question just hangs in the air over everything. Can you imagine yourself being in the city at that moment? And here's what strikes me about this. It wasn't a sermon that stirred the city. It wasn't a sermon, it wasn't an argument or a carefully crafted theological debate. It wasn't a marketing campaign or an outreach event. It was ordinary people who had heard only reports of what had happened and some eyewitnesses, and they just could not contain what they had seen. They could not hold it in any longer. They were caught up in something so real that the entire city stopped and started talking and started asking questions. And the question of who Jesus is was awakened in Jerusalem, not by someone making a polished case for him, but by people whose unmistakable response to him made everyone around them lean in. Said, man, you got to come see this guy. You got to come hear what he is offering. You got to see. We don't know what he's going to do next. He just raised this guy from the dead. You've got to come and hear it. And this is actually still how it works today. You may or may not realize it, but your response to Jesus, each one of your responses to Jesus is being watched by people around you. I don't know if you have realized the gravity of that. The way you talk about him, the way your life has changed because of him, the peace that you're able to carry through tough seasons, the generosity you show when it doesn't make sense to be generous. All of it functions like those palm branches and that crowd on the road. The ordinary people caught up in something real become the means by which whole communities start asking the most important question in the world. Who is this? That's my hope for our community. The community of Clinton, the county of DeWitt, I would love for them all to begin asking the question, who is this? Who is this man? Verse 14, it says, Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it. As it is written, do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. John's pointing us back to Zechariah chapter 9. You got to understand that was written 500 years before this actually took place, before this moment. The prophet Zechariah had predicted that the king of Israel would come riding on a donkey. I want you to understand the significance of that. Kings in that day, they would ride war horses. They would come in and they would drive out the Romans and reclaim. That's who they wanted. They rode donkeys when they were coming in peace. Crowd lining the road, they wanted a warrior king, one who would drive out the Romans. But Jesus showed up on a borrowed baby donkey's colt. Not exactly the hero entrance they had in mind, right? That's not exactly what they were thinking, but he was making a statement, a very intentional statement, that was the exact opposite of what they were expecting. See, Jesus, he had the right identity. He knew he was king, but it was a completely different agenda than the one that the crowd had written for him. This is kind of the tension of the whole passage. The crowd is celebrating Jesus, but they are celebrating a version of Jesus that they had invented and expected. They wanted him to fix their political problem, their frustration of being under Roman rule. They wanted relief from this Roman occupation. They wanted national restoration and earthly power. And Jesus came to fix something so much deeper, so much more permanent than any of that. He came to fix their eternal problem. The problem of sin and separation from God that no political revolution could ever touch. That's why he came. And I think that we do this sometimes, maybe more often than we'd like to admit. How many of us, we come to Jesus primarily because we want him to fix our circumstances. We want him to come through on the job situation. We want him to heal the marriage. We want him to settle the finances and to smooth out the hard season that we're walking through. And I want you to hear this. He does care about those things deeply. He cares about everything that concerns you. He does. But if that is the primary reason why you are following him, is for him to fix those circumstances, if our devotion rises and falls based on whether or not he is meeting our expectations, then we're standing in that crowd on Palm Sunday, waving our branches and shouting his name, but missing the whole point of why he came. Jesus did not ride into Jerusalem to be a political revolutionary. He did not come to make your life comfortable. He rode into Jerusalem to go to a cross. The triumphal entry was not the destination, it was the road to the destination. Everything about this moment, the crowd, the palm branches, the shouting, the city stirring, all of it was pointing to Friday. And Friday is where the real victory happens. That's the great irony of the Holy Week. What looks like a triumph on Sunday, Palm Sunday, when he's coming in, it feels good, leads to a tragedy on Friday. But what looks like a tragedy on Friday is actually the greatest victory in the history of the world. Jesus knew exactly where that road was leading. He knew exactly what he was getting himself into. He was not surprised by the cross. He was not a victim of circumstances that got out of hand. He rode into Jerusalem with the full knowledge of what was waiting for him, and he went anyway. Because you are worth it. Because we are worth it. Luke's gospel shares this in its version of the event. In Luke 19, verse 41, it says, as he approached Jerusalem, he's on the donkey. It says, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. He wept over it. A commentary I read this week, it said this about this. He said, Jesus isn't shedding quiet tears. He's weeping openly, lamenting the fate of the city. This grief isn't about personal suffering, but about the people's rejection of God's offer of peace. And it shows Jesus' deep care for us. His heart for his people, his desire to have our relationship with him restored. And here's where the three groups in the crowd speak directly to us today. Because if you look around this room right now, I think you can find yourself in one of those three groups. Maybe you're like the Passover pilgrims. You've heard about Jesus. People in your life have talked about him. Maybe you've grown up in church. Maybe a friend invited you here this morning, and you've not had some dramatic encounter with Jesus, but the reports have been compelling enough to get you into the room. This isn't a small thing. Do not underestimate what God can do with somebody who simply shows up. But maybe you're an eyewitness, like in verse 17. You've seen what Jesus can do up close. There's maybe been a moment in your life, maybe more than one, where you watched him do something you cannot explain in any other way. And because of that, you can't stop talking about him. You can't help but keep inviting him in. You're the ones in this room who have become that kind of irresistible witness that stirs people around you, and they start asking questions on their own because of your story. And maybe, and I want to be careful here because this is one of the more common things that happen in churches than we'd like to admit, but maybe you're like one of the Pharisees. Maybe you're more like them than you want to be. Maybe you're present, you're observant, you know all the right things about Jesus, but somewhere along the way, your relationship with him became more about maintaining your position or your comfort and your version of how things should go than it is about following Jesus and where he leads. Pharisees, they weren't outsiders. They were deeply religious people who had simply decided that Jesus didn't fit their plan. Jesus didn't fit their plan, what they wanted to do. And so as we begin this Holy Week, I want to bring you back to that question that was hanging over Jerusalem on that Sunday morning. Who is this? Who is this? It is the same question that everyone in this room has to answer. Not who does your family say that he is, not who does this church say that he is, or a church background that you've been a part of say that he is. Not who did you decide he was 10 years ago, but who do you say he is right now? That's the question that Palm Sunday opens up for us. And it's not a comfortable question because Jesus has a way of not being exactly how we expected. Being a little bit different than the way we expected it. The crowd shouting his name on Sunday was shouting, "Crucify him," by Friday. The difference was not that Jesus changed. The difference was that he did not perform the way that they wanted him to. He did not meet their expectations, and so they turned on him. The question is not whether Jesus is who he says he is. The resurrection at the end of the week settles that permanently. The question is whether we are willing to follow him on his terms rather than our own. Are you willing to follow him on his terms rather than your own? Are you willing to let him be the king that he actually is instead of the king that we want him to be? This week, I want to invite you to walk through Holy Week slowly, intentionally, thinking about what Jesus went through. Monday through Saturday, before we get to the celebration of Easter Sunday, there's a lot of ground to cover. Temple overturned, hard conversations with people who are trying to trap him, a Last Supper, a garden where he sweat drops of blood because of what was coming, a trial, a cross, a tomb. Do not skip to Sunday without sitting with all of that for a little while. Because the weight of Friday is what makes Sunday matter. And let the question follow you through the week. Who is this? Answer it honestly. Answer it personally. Because Palm Sunday is not just a story about a crowd 2,000 years ago lining the road with branches. It's an invitation extended to every person in this room to recognize the moment we are standing in and to respond to the King who is still riding in. Let me pray for us today. Father, we come before you now so thankful for the way that you've recorded the story of Palm Sunday for us, for what it means. Father, help us to really wrestle with who Jesus is to us and how that changes our lives moving forward. And pray this in Jesus' name.